Hi, and welcome to Fireside Chats, which is a series of curated conversations as part of the Data Values project at the GPSDD. I'm Rebecca Firth, and I'm the Senior Director of Strategy and Programs at Humanitarian OpenStreetMap Team, which is a citizen-generated data mapping organisation. And I'm here today with Innocent Maholi, who's the Executive Director of OpenMap Development Tanzania, which is an organisation working with youth and community members and organisations in Tanzania to make representative maps that can be owned by the community themselves. Obviously, that's a really cool idea, which lots of people working in data values will be interested in. Loads of people working in the sustainable development data sector are kind of talking about how do we build better community ownership over data? How do we partner with communities in an equitable way to reduce barriers to data access? And how do we recognise and shift power dynamics in the data sector? And Innocent is a real-life example of someone who's already doing those things. So with that, it would be great to introduce Innocent and learn more about OpenMap Development Tanzania. Just wondering, Innocent, if you can give us sort of a brief introduction to OMDTZ and tell us a bit more about the context of your work with data.
Thank you, Rebecca. And by the way, thank you for having me here. So OpenMap Development Tanzania, also abbreviated as OMDTZ, is a local registered NGO that is based in Dar es Salaam and operating across Tanzania. The NGO was established in 2017 and specializes in creating and using open data by leveraging the use of open source technology and training community members on how they could collect the data and then make use out of the data to transform the communities. Back to you.
That's amazing. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. It would be lovely to kind of contextualize a bit for anyone listening, kind of what's the potential for how open mapping can impact your community. I'm wondering if you could maybe share sort of one or two stories of the local value of data use in your community.
So the local value of data use in local communities can help transform the way decisions are being made, by governments or other development partners that are, doing lots of work in the communities. And with that, what I mean is they are then with the data that they have in hand or the maps that they have in hand, they are making calculated risks, and also they are making informed decisions so that they can somehow improve the communities and be able to create, a better environment for the communities, to grow and improve, and as well, solving their local challenges. And with this, it can be ranging between, urban issues such as informal settlements, whether they are serviced or not. And from these maps, you can be able to allocate some sort of, services, distribution of, different kind of services. And apart from that, the other ways, maybe an example is the maps could also be used in terms of use cases like flooding, for example, making sure that the communities are resilient in flooding and they can be able to make sure that they solve the problem within the communities.
Just wondering if you can sort of share with us some of the challenges or barriers that you face to working with communities. And then also with partners, sort of, is there a difference between those two experiences? What do you need to do as an organization to try to make that work?
Yeah, so I'll start with, the challenges that we face, especially working with the communities, because the reason why we work with the communities is because we want to make sure that they own the initiative, whether it's a project or it's an initiative within the organization itself. We need the buy-in from the community members so that they can feel as part of the solution to the problem that they're solving. But also, apart from that, they can also contribute their local knowledge on the problem that challenges them. So, as far as challenges is concerned, in most cases, we find that the communities are not at the same level of skills and knowledge when it comes to mapping. So even though that is not a major challenge, because part of the program is to train community members, the main challenge becomes when, let's say, we finish mapping, and then there is a need for mapping to keep going. That's when there's a certain kind of challenge, because access to computers, access to smartphones is quite challenging in most communities. So people do not have access to this, and if sometimes they do, internet packages are somehow expensive. So people may ask themselves, why do I need to buy an expensive package so that I can, let's say, map this hospital or something like that? So that is where we are trying to somehow support the communities through different micro grants and different programs that are coming, but this is still quite challenging for us. As far as the government is concerned, I think the level of engagement is a little bit low, because government has its own way of doing things, and somehow some of these things are not open. Let's say the data is not open. The tools that are used, they are also not open. So it's quite very challenging for this kind of engagement, because everything that is being done within the government is closed. Even though we have done lots of workshops, trying to make sure that they're also incorporated into, changing the ways that they're doing things, and using open source technologies like QGIS, which is free. But yeah, this is still a journey for us.
Yeah, that sounds really complicated. And maybe just to take the kind of community side of it first, I think one thing that's really important to the Data Values Project is kind of community ownership and creating a space in which kind of community power over their own data is increased. I think one thing that's really interesting about the examples you shared is kind of communities mapping their local environment. That's actually knowledge that the community has that no one else has. People from outside don't have that. So there's actually a kind of innate power balance in favor of the community there, in terms of the knowledge and being able to sort of represent and share that, which is really interesting. And obviously using open source to make that accessible and something that you can actually scale locally. And that piece you said about smartphones and computers, I think that's a really good example of what's needed for power sharing to really work around something like this. Tech accessibility, from everything from actually owning the right quality devices through to having the kind of tools you're using for data collection be locally appropriate, is definitely a bit of a challenge. It'd be interesting to hear. I know OMDTZ has done quite a lot of work around bringing accessible tech and influencing tech to be more accessible, which is really unique and kind of fabulous way of dealing with that problem locally, sort of saying, this tech isn't accessible enough for us to do our work properly. What can we do about that? Just wondering if maybe you could share an example. I remember we were speaking recently about the bamboo drones that you've been making. Maybe you could kind of share with us how you've gone about taking something really expensive and complicated like a drone and making it locally appropriate.
So thank you again for that question. So as I said before, part of the pillars that OMDTZ is sitting on is innovation. And with innovation, the idea is to create local solutions that would be impactful and giving access to local communities on the technology that is out there today. And one of it is the drone mapping technology, which we all know that is crucial for mapping, because you need high resolution images, but also you need updated images so that you can be able to create data sets like buildings, boats on top of OpenStreetMap. So in doing so, as we all know that drones are expensive, and for a professional mapping drone, you need around $15,000 US or more than that, depending with accuracy and resolution that you want, so that you can be able to have access to a drone. But at OMDTZ, we had invested our time and knowledge and skills into, trying to help the communities. Because, when we talk about 15,000 US dollars for an average African, that's too much money. And maybe in their lifetime, they won't be able to have access to this kind of funding. So ideally, we wanted to create something that would give the same level of, access as a drone, but, at a cheaper price. And that's when we thought of, creating something that would be first easily accessible, but also second, something that could be easily, not only operated but reused. So as we all know that with drones, it's quite risky. There is lots of crashes, which can damage the drone. And with the bamboo drone that we came up with, it is quite easy for you to assemble. First, for you to access, because the bamboo trees are all over, many places. So it's easy to have access to them. And with this drone, you can imagine that it's around 500 US dollars, which is way more cheaper compared to the professional, but gives the same kind of accuracy and output as compared to the professional drones. So yeah, that would be my response to that.
Wow, yeah, that's amazing. Kind of being able to produce a drone for 500 USD completely locally with no dependency on, international supplies if there's a crash or something. Yeah, that's amazing. One thing you mentioned was around sort of data use and like once a map's made, what's the barriers to get data use to happen? And you mentioned some stuff around government and kind of trying to work with like a data innovation in a quite a sort of traditional system. There's a lot of people watching this that work in very different roles around, policy, advisory, consultancy. What would you kind of advise to those people? Like, what do you think needs to change to make sustained use of data and open data a reality?
I think first thing first, I think recognizing data that comes from the communities. And when I say communities, I'm talking about open mapping initiatives. Is one of the first thing that we should do, because as I talked about, with communities mapping their own areas, they are providing a unique information, which is what is really happening on the ground. So apart from that, I think making sure that we innovate or otherwise create open source technologies, because as for us, our focus is to make sure that we come up with things that can be scaled not only in Tanzania but in Africa and in other parts of the world. So coming out with things that can easily scale, whether and they are somehow not technically hard for people to understand and use. I think that would be something that I recommend. And let's just make sure that we capacitate our communities, because they have so much information that they can share with us, and then we can use to make decisions that are affecting the areas that we are interested in.
Yeah, I really like that point. I think understanding that not all data looks the same, but that doesn't mean that it's not equally valid, is a really, really important point, and especially for those of us who are used to looking at data in quite a traditional way, something that is really important to kind of open our eyes to. So one thing that would be really interesting to hear is, obviously Tanzania is a really big and varied country, and you do loads of projects across all sorts of different sectors and locations, and it would just be interesting to hear if you think some of the barriers that you've raised are context specific, like to particular places, problems, or if they vary across the country.
Thank you for that question as well. I'd say some of the barriers are coming from, I'd say maybe the data use part, because like I understand that there's lots of communities or organizations that are collecting this information, and the idea is for the data that we collect is to help the government transform the communities and, especially as well as, the development partners as well. But somehow you find that there are different things that, like, there are different focuses in terms of, the priorities within the government and the priorities within the development sectors. And within the government, I think, because government wants to use closed data, that because I understand this is for security purpose, which is understandable. But then some of the things that are quite different from the way maybe open mapping is doing. So government is using closed data, for example, for decision making, maybe about taxation and stuff like that. And when it comes to additional information like data that is in OpenStreetMap, for example, it becomes the government becomes very hesitant to use that kind of data because they also ask, some of the valid questions like, this information keeps changing from time to time. Why should we trust this information? And ideally, the information changes time to time because we want to make sure that the information is better compared to what was there yesterday. So some of the barriers are, within the data users, as I said, but I think that is still a conversation to have and make sure that we also capacitate our especially people from the government and the people from the other, partners, to make sure that they understand the data and then they can be able to use the data and, make a comparison and see whether it can fit for their use or not, instead of just bashing it generic.
Yeah, and I think one thing sort of, we can do in our own work is try to kind of create a bridge between those two groups. How can we take these official, very formal data systems and these, innovative ways of creating data that are community-based and sort of build a bridge between those two groups, which is kind of, could unlock a huge amount of potential. Something you've mentioned a few times is kind of challenges of working with government or in the kind of formal context of data in Tanzania. And I know kind of Tanzania is a place where there have been quite rapidly changing regulations around data collection, which can be really difficult for data actors like yourselves. So just wondering if you could maybe explain to us a bit about those changes and how they've affected your work.
That is also true. Before the changes, the one thing that we did was making sure that we also incorporate the government in whatever initiative that we were doing. And by saying so, we need to make sure, let's say we have a new project today about, let's say, mapping maybe for flood resilience, for example. The first thing you need is you need to make sure that the government has the buy-in. You have to make sure that they see the value of the data that will help them, and not that the data that is only or is going to be wasted. So that's what we did first. So we wanted to make sure that we engage with the government and make sure that they understand the value, they understand the idea behind the mapping, and who will be the beneficiary of the data. In doing so, you also need to make sure that you have the necessary permissions for you to conduct the research. And the good part was we also shared this information with all the stages that we went through. So starting from the wards level, coming to the municipal level, we shared all of this data, all of this information in digital formats, in printed formats like maps that were also pinned in the offices, and that's why I think we somehow were able to penetrate between the politics and the bureaucracy within the government, and being able to get their their approval and also their support on some of these initiatives.
Yeah, wow. So that sounds like a lot of paperwork and administration, but also something you said that was really interesting that I think sometimes kind of data nerds don't think about enough, which is what's the value of this data? What are you actually using it for? Tying that data to a use case that can clearly say, like, this is why this is important. I think gets missed in quite a lot of, especially kind of very large scale data projects. Kind of, it's not data for data's sake, it's data for a reason, which is really nice. So yeah, one last thing I really wanted to get your opinion on is, sort of through this conversation, you've used the word community and local quite a lot. And I think those are things that the global, data sector seems quite vague on right now. Doesn't have a kind of great understanding of what those words mean, but is trying to achieve those things. A lot of the data to community is talking about trying to increasingly localize. And some efforts towards that can seem quite sort of tokenistic or perhaps a bit inappropriate. And OMDTZ is one of the best examples of localized data creation and ownership and use that I've come across. So I'm just wondering, sort of, what advice do you have for others in trying to do that, in trying to kind of work with to localize the data you're doing, that you're creating? What advice would you have for other people listening?
Yeah. So I'll answer to that with, I think a principle that we have inherited from our mentor, Ivan Dayton, which says local people, local devices, open knowledge. So local people in terms of, you want to make sure that you incorporate, let's say you have a project or you have an initiative that is studying something, but you have to make sure that you bring ownership from the local people. And in doing so, if you also engage them into the, let's say, data collection process or otherwise data use process, you also bring ownership of the project to them, and you are sharing, all the experience and skills with them. So with local people, I would advise for most people to follow this advice, because it really pays off, because from there, your initiative will be smoothly, conducted within the communities, because people, like communities, will see value in what you are doing, as long as they understand that what you are doing is meant to help them solve their local challenges. And then local devices, you have to make sure that you are using, some locally available tools. So I was talking about, smartphone applications earlier. And with this, I understand that it may vary from different contexts, whether it's urban areas or rural areas. But we should try to use local devices as much as we can. Whether it's smartphones, for example, I know smartphones are not. We are not like Tanzanians are creating smartphones, but somehow if the communities have access to this kind of stuff in urban setting, yes, you can use it. If you go to rural areas and then you find that there are challenges, in accessing smartphones, then that means you need to switch to, printed maps, for example. So local devices is something that I can also emphasize on. And lastly, open knowledge. And that's why we are championing for open data, open source softwares, and all of these kind of things can be easily replicated. And ideally, because for us, we want to make sure that we start something locally, but create something that can be, scaled up in other places. And if you only sit on top of the technology that was, used to create a solution to the problem, it means that other communities will fail to, reach the same kind of effort. So yeah, we want to emphasize that, open knowledge is something that we can also advise people to rely on and build things upon.
Mm-hmm. Wow, yeah, I love that. So simple. Local people, local devices, open knowledge. And probably, that's something we should turn into a question for anyone listening to this. If your project doesn't have those things, then you should question the validity of how local or community-based it can ever be, because those things are going to act as really serious barriers to achieving those goals. So with that, let's close here. Thank you so much, Innocent, for sharing the journey of OpenMap Development Tanzania with us. It's clearly been, 7 years of really hard and long work for you to get to this point of, being so established and working on, such interesting projects and themes. Really encourage anyone looking for local innovations in community data ownership and open source tech to reach out to Innocent. And with that, this has been a Data Values Project Fireside Chat. You can follow the conversation on social media at #DataValues, and you can subscribe to the YouTube channel to keep up with any other Fireside Chats as they're released. Thank you so much. Goodbye.